Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where the numbers on a price tag actually made sense. In the mid-1960s, the American dream wasn't a metaphor or a distant goal. It was a tangible, affordable reality. At the heart of this era was a figure that seems like a typographical error today: $15,000. That was the average price of a brand new detached family home. For the price of a modest used car in the modern era, you could secure a piece of land, a front porch, and a lifetime of stability. But it wasn't just about the cheap real estate, it was about the purchasing power of a single paycheck. This was the age of the sole breadwinner. A father could work a steady job at the local plant, a retail shop, or an office, and that one salary acted like a superpower. It covered the mortgage, filled the pantry, paid for the station wagon, and still left enough in the jar for a 2-week summer trip to the coast. There was a profound sense of keeping up without having to run a marathon. You weren't just surviving, you were building. The cost of living didn't just feel lower, it felt stable. Think about pulling your car into a service station. You didn't even have to get out. For about 30 cents a gallon, you'd get a full tank of leaded gasoline. And that wasn't a fuel saver discount or a promotional gimmick. That was simply the price of doing business. While the pump hummed, a man in a crisp uniform would check your oil and scrub the bugs off your windshield as part of the service. There was a dignity in the transaction that surpassed the mere exchange of coins. This was a time of front porch culture. Because the financial pressure wasn't a crushing weight on every household, people had the literal and mental space to be neighbors. You knew the names of the kids 3 houses down. You knew whose dog was prone to digging and whose lawn was the pride of the block. The white picket fence wasn't designed to keep people out. It was a frame for a life that felt balanced. In the 1960s, a dollar wasn't just currency. It was a promise that if you worked your 40 hours, the world would give you back a life of comfort, a doorbell that worked, and the quiet peace of mind that tomorrow would cost exactly the same as today. If the home was the heart of the 1960s, the automobile was its soul. In this era, a car wasn't merely a tool for transportation, it was a declaration of identity. This was the golden age of Detroit steel, a time when chrome wasn't a luxury, it was a standard. The pinnacle of this cultural explosion arrived in the spring of 1964, when the first Ford Mustang rolled off the assembly line. It was a mechanical earthquake. Suddenly, the sensible, boxy sedans of the previous generation felt like ancient history. The Mustang offered something the youth of the 60s craved more than anything else: absolute freedom on 4 wheels. If you were a teenager in the mid-60s, that car was the ultimate North Star. It represented the moment the world shifted from utility to style. But the experience of owning a vehicle back then was worlds away from our modern, automated reality. Driving was a sensory, hands-on ritual. There were no digital screens, no GPS coordinates, and certainly no self-driving assists. You had a heavy steering wheel, a steel dashboard, and the rhythmic clicking of a mechanical odometer. Visual: a vintage Mustang idling at a drive-in diner, neon lights reflecting off the chrome bumper. The gas station of the 1960s was a theater of hospitality. Today, we stand in the cold, swiping plastic cards at silent pumps, but back then, you were greeted by the service station attendant. These men were the unsung heroes of the American highway. Wearing matching caps and uniforms, they would jog out to your window before you even turned off the ignition. It was a comprehensive pit stop. While the regular gas flowed at 32 cents a gallon, the attendant was a whirlwind of activity. He'd check the tension on your fan belt, pull the dipstick to inspect your oil, and vigorously polish your windshield until it gleamed. If you were headed out of town, he'd reach into his pocket and hand you a crisp folding paper map for free. There was no searching for signal. You simply unfolded the world on your lap and followed the red lines. The roads themselves felt different. This was the era of the burgeoning interstate system, a network of fresh asphalt that seemed to promise that you could go anywhere and be anyone. Whether it was the low rumble of a V8 engine idling at a red light, or the sight of a station wagon packed to the brim with luggage and a loose family dog, the road was a shared stage. It was a time of coins, a nod, and a smile, a period when the journey truly mattered as much as the destination, and the smell of gasoline and hot asphalt was the undisputed scent of progress. Before the era of massive supermarkets and overnight digital deliveries, the neighborhood functioned as a living, breathing organism. In the 1960s, the world came to your doorstep. Long before the sun had fully crested the horizon, the silence of the morning was broken by a very specific musical sound, the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of glass bottles. The milkman was a cornerstone of the suburban ecosystem. He wasn't just a delivery driver, he was a silent guardian of the morning ritual. Clad in a crisp white uniform, he would swap empty glass containers for fresh, heavy bottles of cream-topped milk, while the rest of the house slept. There were no plastic jugs or expiration dates printed in bold ink. Instead, there was the cold, condensation-covered glass and the small, metallic foil caps. If it was a special occasion, or perhaps just a lucky Tuesday, he might leave a bottle of chocolate milk, a thick, rich treat that made the kitchen table feel like a holiday. This wasn't about logistics. It was about a level of personal service that anchored the community. Visual, a close-up of glass milk bottles on a porch in the early morning light, transitioned to a traditional barber shop with a spinning pole. This sense of connection extended to the local barbershop, which served as the neighborhood's original social network. You didn't need an app to find out what was happening in town. You just needed to wait your turn in a heavy, leather-bound hydraulic chair. Inside, the air was a thick mixture of talcum powder, peppermint-scented aftershave, and the low hum of a radio that stayed tuned to the same station for a decade. The barbershop was a democratic space. Men from all walks of life. The bank manager, the mechanic, the high school coach sat side by side on checkerboard floors, discussing the local high school football scores or the latest headlines from Washington. There were no quick cuts or express trims. It was a deliberate, slow-paced environment where a shave with a straight razor was a rite of passage and a haircut came with a side of civic debate. Even the kids played a role in this local economy. The paperboy was a neighborhood fixture, weaving his bicycle through the streets with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, perfecting the art of the porch toss. These small daily interactions, the nod to the mailman, the greeting from the milkman, the gossip at the barber, created a web of accountability. You weren't just a face in a crowd, you were a member of a collective. In the 1960s, your neighborhood wasn't just where you lived, it was who you were. In the 1960s, the television wasn't just an appliance, it was the electronic hearth of the American home. But unlike today's sleek, ultra-thin panels that hang silently on walls, a 1960s TV was a massive piece of furniture, often encased in heavy wood grain, with a screen that took a full minute to warm up. You'd flip the knob, hear a low hum, and wait for a tiny dot of light to expand into a flickering, grainy image. The struggle for a clear picture was a physical sport. Every set was crowned with rabbit ears, telescoping metal antennas that required the precision of a diamond cutter to adjust. One family member would stand by the set, twisting the metal rods and adding bits of tin foil to the tips, while the rest of the family shouted instructions from the sofa. "Hold it right there, don't move!" If you stepped away, the static returned. It was a communal battle against the elements just to watch a 30-minute sitcom. Visual. A family huddled around a glowing black and white TV. The screen shows the iconic test pattern after programming ends. But when the picture finally locked in, the experience was profound. This was the era of appointment viewing. There were no streaming services, no recording devices, and no watching it later. If you weren't in your living room at 8:12 p.m., you simply missed the cultural conversation of the week. Shows like I Love Lucy or The Andy Griffith Show weren't just entertainment, they were the shared language of the country. Nothing, however, compared to the gravity of the nightly news. When Walter Cronkite appeared on the screen, the room went silent. He didn't offer hot takes or flashy graphics. He sat in a simple suit and delivered the world to your doorstep with a steady, authoritative calm. Whether he was reporting on the space race or the somber realities of Vietnam, he was the most trusted man in America. When he signed off with his signature, "And that's the way it is," it felt like a final, indisputable truth. The decade also witnessed a technological miracle, the transition from black and white to vibrant color. When a neighbor finally bought a color TV, it was a neighborhood event. You'd go over to their house just to stare at the NBC Peacock in all its prismatic glory. It felt like the future had finally arrived in the living room, turning the world from a shades of gray newsreel into a vivid, technicolor dream. As the night ended, the station would play the national anthem, the screen would fade to a static test pattern, and the hum of the vacuum tubes would slowly fade, leaving the house in a quiet, satisfied dark. While the 1960s are often remembered through a lens of sunny suburbia and neon diners, there was a persistent, shivering undercurrent that defined the era: the Cold War. For a child growing up in this decade, the threat of nuclear annihilation wasn't a distant political concept. It was a part of the school curriculum. This was the age of the duck and cover drill. At the sound of a sharp siren or a teacher's sudden command, an entire generation of students would scramble beneath their wooden desks, tucking their heads between their knees and covering their necks with their hands. Even at the time, there was a surreal quality to it. We knew, deep down, that a thin layer of plywood wouldn't stand a chance against an atomic blast, but the ritual provided a strange, structured comfort. It made the unthinkable feel manageable. The scariest part wasn't the drill itself. It was how normal it felt to prepare for the end of the world before your afternoon spelling test. Visual, archival footage of a 1960s classroom, duck and cover drill, transitioned to a family huddled around a radio in a dimly lit kitchen. The tension reached a breaking point in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the entire world seemed to hold its collective breath. This wasn't just the news. It was a physical knot in the stomach of every adult. You would see men standing on street corners, staring at the sky a little longer than usual, and mothers keeping the radio on in the kitchen from dawn until dusk. People began quietly stocking their basements with canned peaches and bottled water, whispering about fallout shelters as if they were discussing a new patio. In those long, harrowing nights, the silence of the neighborhood felt heavy. Every distant plane engine or sudden backfire from a car caused hearts to skip a beat. It was a time when the global stage felt very small, and the decisions made in the Oval Office or the Kremlin felt like they were happening in your own backyard. This period of history created a unique psychological paradox, a society that was hyper-focused on a bright, space-age future, yet simultaneously lived with the constant knowledge that it could all vanish in a flash of light. It lent a certain preciousness to everyday life. You cherished the backyard barbecue or the Saturday morning cartoon a little more because you had been taught, quite literally, that the world was fragile. The 1960s were lived in the high contrast light of progress and the long dark shadow of the bomb. The 1960s was a decade you could feel in your hands. Long before the era of digital clouds and haptic glass, technology was heavy, mechanical, and required a certain degree of muscle memory. Take, for instance, the family photo. Today, we capture thousands of images that sit forgotten in a phone's memory. But back then, every shutter click was a commitment. If you wanted a candid moment, you had to deal with the flashbulb, a tiny, oxygen-filled glass orb that would pop with a blinding sizzle and become searingly hot to the touch. You'd carry a pocketful of these used bulbs like spent ammunition, having blinded your relatives just to ensure Aunt Martha was actually in the frame. Then, of course, there was the Polaroid. It was the closest thing to real-world sorcery the 60s had to offer. You'd snap the photo, hear the mechanical whir, and watch a damp square of grey film slide out. The ritual of shaking it, despite the instructions telling you not to, was a mandatory part of the experience. Watching a face slowly emerge from the chemical fog felt like witnessing a ghost materialize. It was instant gratification in a world that usually demanded weeks of waiting for a developer to mail back your prints. Visual: a hand loading a circular slide tray into a projector, the dusty beam of light cutting through a dark living room. The true pinnacle of 1960s home entertainment, however, was the slide projector. This was the multimedia presentation of the era. The living room would be transformed into a makeshift theater. The lights were dimmed, a beaded screen was dragged out of the closet, and the heavy, metallic click-whoosh chunk of the carousel became the heartbeat of the evening. There was something hypnotic about the smell of the hot projector lamp cooking the dust in the air. You'd sit in the dark, eating a slice of pound cake as your father narrated a 3-week-old vacation to the Grand Canyon. Half the slides would be upside down, some would be blurry shots of a highway, and inevitably, the heat of the bulb would cause a slide to pop out of focus. It was slow, it was often repetitive, but it was a shared experience. You weren't scrolling through a feed in isolation. You were gathered in the dark, tethered together by a flickering beam of light. This tactile reality extended to every corner of life. It was the smell of purple mimeograph ink on a fresh school worksheet, warm and chemically sweet. It was the thud of a heavy underwood typewriter key and the frustration of a ribbon smudge. In the 1960s, you didn't just use technology, you operated it. Everything had a weight, a scent, and a mechanical soul that required your full attention. The 1960s was a decade you could feel in your hands. Long before the era of digital clouds and haptic glass, technology was heavy, mechanical, and required a certain degree of muscle memory. Take, for instance, the family photo. Today, we capture thousands of images that sit forgotten in a phone's memory, but back then, every shutter click was a commitment. If you wanted a candid moment, you had to deal with the flashbulb, a tiny, oxygen-filled glass orb that would pop with a blinding sizzle and become searingly hot to the touch. You'd carry a pocketful of these used bulbs like spent ammunition, having blinded your relatives just to ensure Aunt Martha was actually in the frame. Then, of course, there was the Polaroid. It was the closest thing to real-world sorcery the 60s had to offer. You'd snap the photo, hear the mechanical whir, and watch a damp square of grey film slide out. The ritual of shaking it, despite the instructions telling you not to, was a mandatory part of the experience. Watching a face slowly emerge from the chemical fog felt like witnessing a ghost materialize. It was instant gratification in a world that usually demanded weeks of waiting for a developer to mail back your prints. Visual: a hand loading a circular slide tray into a projector, the dusty beam of light cutting through a dark living room. The true pinnacle of 1960s home entertainment, however, was the slide projector. This was the multimedia presentation of the era. The living room would be transformed into a makeshift theater. The lights were dimmed, a beaded screen was dragged out of the closet, and the heavy, metallic, click-whoosh chunk of the carousel became the heartbeat of the evening. There was something hypnotic about the smell of the hot projector lamp cooking the dust in the air. You'd sit in the dark, eating a slice of pound cake as your father narrated a 3-week-old vacation to the Grand Canyon. Half the slides would be upside down, some would be blurry shots of a highway, and inevitably, the heat of the bulb would cause a slide to pop out of focus. It was slow, it was often repetitive, but it was a shared experience. You weren't scrolling through a feed in isolation. You were gathered in the dark, tethered together by a flickering beam of light. This tactile reality extended to every corner of life. It was the smell of purple mimeograph ink on a fresh school worksheet, warm and chemically sweet. It was the thud of a heavy Underwood typewriter key and the frustration of a ribbon smudge. In the 1960s, you didn't just use technology, you operated it. Everything had a weight, a scent, and a mechanical soul that required your full attention. Daily life in the 1960s was governed by a set of social layers that dictated how you presented yourself to the world. There was a clear line between public and private life, and nowhere was this more evident than in the ritual of Sunday best. Sunday morning wasn't just a time for church, it was a weekly performance of respectability. Men donned heavy wool suits and fedoras, while women wore white gloves and structured pillbox hats. For children, it was a test of endurance. You spent hours in stiff, itchy collars and patent leather shoes that pinched with every step, sitting on hard wooden pews and counting the minutes until brunch. Dressing up was a sign of belonging, a way of saying that you were a part of the community's moral fabric. But when you returned home and the good clothes were hung back in the closet, you entered a domestic world designed for durability. This was the era of formica and chrome. Your kitchen table likely featured a swirling, pastel-colored pattern, mint green or pale yellow, surrounded by vinyl-seated chairs that squeaked when you moved. These materials were the miracles of the mid-century, designed to be wiped clean of any mess. However, the most infamous symbol of 1960s domesticity was the plastic couch cover. In an effort to preserve the good furniture for guests who might never arrive, many mothers encased their floral sofas in thick, clear vinyl. In the winter, it was a cold, crinkly shield. In the summer, it was a literal trap. If you sat down in shorts, you were effectively glued to the seat. The moment you tried to stand up, the plastic would groan and peel away from your skin with a sound that could be heard in the next room. It was an era that valued preservation, keeping things like new, even if it meant you couldn't actually enjoy them. Even the way we kept our homes clean was a public affair. The clothesline was the neighborhood's silent billboard. On any given Monday, backyards were filled with sheets flapping in the breeze and towels drying until they were stiff as boards. There was no hiding your laundry from the neighbors. The way you pinned your shirts was a reflection of your housekeeping skills. But there was a reward for the labor, the smell of line-dried linen. It was the scent of sunshine and fresh air, a natural fragrance that no modern dryer sheet has ever truly managed to replicate. Life in the 60s was often rigid and itchy, but it was anchored by a sense of order and a deep, tactile connection to the home. As the 1960s drew to a close, the sense of absolute certainty that had defined the post-war era began to flicker and change. It is often said that the decade didn't truly end on a calendar date, but rather through a series of shocks to the collective system. For many, that moment was November 22nd, 1963. Every person who lived through it can tell you exactly where they were when the music stopped and the news from Dallas broke. It was the first time the entire nation mourned together, illuminated by the cold, flickering light of millions of television screens. Something in the American psyche cracked that day, a loss of innocence that could never quite be mended. By the late 60s, the white picket fence was being challenged by the summer of love, the civil rights movement, and the growing roar of jet engines heading toward Southeast Asia. The world was becoming louder, faster, and more complex. The rotary phones were being replaced by push buttons. The quiet, hat-tipping etiquette of the sidewalk was giving way to a more hurried, individualistic pace. The golden twilight was fading into the neon high-energy transition of the 1970s. Yet for those who were there, the 1960s remain a vivid, sensory memory. It was a time when you could still buy a piece of the world for a handful of pennies, when a man's word was his bond, and when the future felt like a place we were all building together. It wasn't a perfect time. It had its shadows and its struggles, but it possessed a unique kind of magic. It was the last era of the analog life where everything you owned had a weight. Every person you knew lived within walking distance, and the simple click of a film reel could bring a whole family together in the dark. If these memories sparked a sense of nostalgia for a simpler time, you might be ready to see how the world transformed in the decades that followed.